Protected Speech with Ravi Kapur and Jonathan Choe.
Alongside Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur for another edition of Protected Speech. This week, we're going to get into a bunch of topics, and the first one I want to discuss is Diwali. That's because it's gone mainstream for the first time. Diwali, which is a huge festival throughout South Asia, India specifically, big festival of lights. It's as big as Happy New Year is in the United States. Well, this year went mainstream. From the White House to Mar-a-Lago, we saw events throughout the country. Jonathan, what did you witness this time out? It seemed to be bigger than ever.
Yeah, bigger than ever in multiple big cities. And again, as you mentioned, a lot of different politicians, highly influential politicians, including New York City Mayor Eric Adams as well on the local level. But again, just incredible dynamic footage coming out, just beautiful colors. Again, it's the Festival of Lights for a reason. And it really is not only an inclusive celebration, but it is a holy holiday as well for many Hindus around the world, Sikhs, Jains, others who celebrate this. But again, I think what really stood out to me are the politicians who have decided to show up and now acknowledge this. Tell me more about that. Why do you think, Ravi, these politicians are coming out? Because I think there's another motive beyond just celebrating.
Well, there's always another motive. Let's face it. I mean, if the community wasn't relevant, this wouldn't be going on. And for decades, the community really wasn't relevant in terms of numbers. But now you see the buying power, and you see that truly when it comes to like Indian Americans specifically or Hindu Americans, it's an absolute swing vote. And that is not being discussed enough. But, you know, those of us who cover this beat understand this dichotomy. And right now, during the midterms, we saw this outreach. Obviously, we have President Trump on screen. This is footage from his Mar-a-Lago event that I got invited to. They also have this thing in the State Department. And of course, we're in the middle of the midterms. The White House, Kamala Harris at the vice presidential residence, all of whom are trying to appeal to this community. And the big swing states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, you look across the board at Arizona, these are all purple states in play. They're all trying to make a push, and Diwali happens to be right in the middle of midterm season.
Yeah, here's the bottom line. Look, as a journalist, I'm always skeptical about motive. Where are all these politicians several years ago, right? Nobody knew what Diwali was, but now when you have the president, the vice president, the former president, and Donald Trump, major mayors and, state and U.S. representatives, acknowledging Diwali, what that signals, what that messages now is that Indian Americans / South Asians, fastest growing Asian American voting bloc, even within Asian Americans, highly educated, deep pockets, and they're players. There's no doubt they're going to be political players. I mean, look at the Biden administration. Credit to President Joe Biden, regardless of political stripes and leanings. Man, I think this administration has the most, South Asians or Indian Americans ever. Isn't that right?
No question. We actually had a chance to interview Neera Tanden, who basically is one of Biden's right-hand people. She's effectively, in my view, kind of the deputy chief of staff, right below Ron Klain. And she puts on his docket, on his desk every day, what he consumes in terms of reading material. And Neera said flat out, about having hundreds of Indian Americans in the Fulton administration has made a big deal. I mean, when she was there during the Clinton administration, there was a couple of people. So it's a huge change. And obviously with Eric Adams and working with Jennifer Rajkumar, who in 2016, we were doing election coverage covering Clinton and Trump. And now she's in the state assembly and really becoming a big name in New York State. And she got not just this Diwali event, but in 2023, Diwali is going to be a school holiday in New York City. That's a huge deal. They're taking away an old holiday, moving Diwali in. This stuff never happened before. Now maybe we'll see Diwali as a larger holiday on a national front. We certainly saw Carolyn Maloney a year ago introduce federal legislation. So this is a big sea change, and there's no question there's political juice tied to it.
Yeah, well, no doubt. As I keep saying, though, at the end of the day, look, we grew up with immigrant parents and the Desi community, the Asian American community. The mainstream media is failing to cover the significance of this story. But it's not just about the holiday, right? It's not just a quick reader by the anchor and you move on. The real story here right now is, what is this community going to do to leverage this? At the end of the day, the politicians are there because the politicians want that vote. But the real question is, will leaders now emerge in the community to leverage this? So the stories, the narrative about the diaspora gets into the public school system, gets into the mainstream conversation now, versus sort of this, hey, let's go get some Indian food, or wow, there are a lot of now Indian CEOs in tech. So let's go beyond the stereotypes. That's the narrative. That's a story I want to see. And if the mainstream media actually wakes up and recognizes that Indian Americans, South Asians played a significant role in getting former President Donald Trump elected, and Republicans now, as you know better than anyone, they're still catering to this group, this diaspora. And I believe the GOP's ahead in this area because of the roots they've already laid down.
Well, we've seen a push by the GOP to get the Indian community on board. We saw this with President Trump back in 2016. I had a chance to interview Dr. Oz, who's making a big push in Pennsylvania. We talked to General Bolduc, who's making a push in New Hampshire. So certainly, like specifically, they're looking at the Hindu American vote in some of these districts. But there's no question that Democrats have had a stronghold on the Indian community this entire time, roughly 80%. Trump made some traction in 2016, but some of that went back to Biden in 2020. So in 2024, as we look 2 years down the line, both of these parties are making a push, and you see it with these Diwali events, and we'll certainly see even more next year. At least that's what I've been told by some of the folks on the inside, that it's going to get even bigger in 2023.
Well, I look forward to seeing that. And again, I hope that the diaspora isn't just relegated to these holidays or these big celebrations, kind of like Chinese New Year, right? That's when the politicians, the only time they usually show up are during these holidays. And I hope the community recognizes, hey, the politicians don't just show up during the holidays, but show up when we need you to get things done.
Well, speaking of leadership roles, another huge story we've been covering is Rishi Sunak becoming the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Obviously, this is kind of a CEO role as well. We've been talking about Indian CEOs. He's the first Prime Minister of Indian descent, of Hindu origin, ever for the United Kingdom. Obviously, if you know the history of India, the story of colonization, England ruled the world, and in particular, the crown jewel was India. But 75 years ago, they basically walked out, licking their wounds after World War II. Sunak, again, a child of that era, but like so many folks, a part of the diaspora, his folks left nearly 100 years ago, went to Africa, then ended up settling in the UK. And now here he is, again, in effect, kind of replacing not just Boris Johnson, who had to step down, but Liz Truss after 6 weeks. Truss and Sunak were in a very tightly contested race just 6 weeks previous. And Sunak fell short. Truss was given the role and almost instantaneously kind of flopped. And her economy, there was basically no confidence in her methodology. And so Sunak is there to continue that conservative tradition. But it's an enormous story on so many levels.
It is enormous, but at the same time, I feel like, look, with all due respect and credit to Prime Minister Sunak, there's going to be an asterisk next to this, because we all know Liz Truss resigned because of the enormous pressure due to some of her early policies, quite frankly, failing and not resonating with the British. Look, I want to see what this guy's going to do. What's he going to do ultimately in office? Yes, he's a conservative. He worked under former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But at the same time, does he have the ability to really bring this country together? Because we know the country's in transition as well. Queen Elizabeth passed away in her 90s just a few weeks ago. Now, King Charles has assumed the leadership role, but we know that's more a ceremonial position. But kind of back to the politics and really the realities, the optics here. This is the first dude with Indian descent, and at the same time, this country has colonialism in its roots, has racism. So I want to know what others are thinking, especially non-brown folks, that, oh my gosh, we have to be under, a British Indian for the first time ever. Not to mention, on top of that, like here in America, British Indians now own, the most real estate, I think, in London. So there's not only a political shift, there is an economic shift. And people on the ground know there's also a cultural shift. So that's what I want to know. What are his critics gonna say? What are the racists saying right now who still exist in that country?
Well, a lot of folks didn't go with Sunak the first time around, right? Truss edged him out. Not that Sunak wasn't qualified. It's just that a lot of people thought there was that dynamic of, Truss being, first of all, Indian, second of all, being Hindu. There's a lot of folks on the left that didn't support him, despite having similar backgrounds, being South Asian. The UK, very diverse. England, in particular, has a huge Pakistani contingent. Obviously, a lot of folks from India, and then, of course, like his family, folks that came from Africa and ended up migrating to the UK. So it's a super diverse, country. And I really look at England as maybe being about 15 or 20 years ahead of where the United States is, at least politically. But we're starting to see that now with Kamala Harris, with Nikki Haley, with
when it comes to Indian Americans and brown folk, you're saying.
Yeah, in terms of political leadership, and I think Sunak obviously,
it's a smaller country too, though. So
it's a smaller country, but let's face it, it's still the sixth largest economy in the world. What's interesting is that India just bypassed England. India is now number 5 in the world, and Sunak and Modi had a conversation, Modi being the prime minister of India, to talk about putting together a free trade deal, which Truss couldn't get done because her home minister, Suella Braverman, who's also of Indian origin, made some comments about colonization that was in effect construed as pro-colonization. And if you're looking at modern day India, there's a lot of folks, those of us who are in the diaspora, who were greatly affected by the colonization of that whole region. I mean, my family is in the United States because India was so ravaged by colonization over 1,000+ years. And so that led folks like Sunak's family and my family and so many other folks to leave. And we know the impact of World War II. So there's a kind of a change in perspective. And India is on the rise. There's no question about it. So that free trade deal collapsing almost in effect kind of put the final nail in Truss's regime. And Braverman had to step down as well for a multitude of reasons, but that was one of them. So this is going to be fascinating to watch because Sunak is someone who's very young, by the way, Jonathan. He's only 42. The guy is actually younger than we are. So it's a generational shift, an enormous generational shift. And we're going to see this transition happen around the globe, which, let's face it, we have a whole bunch of 70 and 80-year-old people running things otherwise.
Well, I want to see if he's really going to be a man of the people or if he's going to come off as one of the elites at the end of the day. That's what it's going to come down to. Can Sunak really be that transcendent leader to be able to reach across not only the political aisle, but also the cultural and class divide that continues in the country as well, as we saw in Brexit.
And as you pointed out, a lot of folks not in favor of him. Again, he wasn't kind of duly elected. The Conservatives had control through Bojo, through Truss. Now Sunak has to win voters over, and he's got some time to do that. But there's a lot of opposition to his reign. Jonathan, what have you been working on this week? I know it's been busy for both of us here in October and November.
Yeah, I mean, there are just so many stories. So, I actually just got back from Washington, D.C., and as I'm a senior fellow and journalist at Discovery Institute in Seattle, and it's crazy. I only have 6 months left, for this media fellowship, and I don't know what my next step is going to be after this. I may end up staying. I may end up leaving. I don't know. But while I'm there, I have the privilege to travel now and really cover the nation's homeless crisis, not just here in Washington State, but across the nation. I've been to Boston, my hometown, to cover the homeless crisis, and most recently, Washington, D.C. And I could not believe with my own eyes in the nation's capital, I saw multiple homeless encampments. One in McPherson Square, especially 30+ tents, just minutes from the White House. And I went there with my colleague, Dr. Robert Marbut Jr. He's also a senior fellow, and he led the team that just released a new report that showed public policy for the past decade in America called Housing First is failing. The premise of Housing First that's been adopted, especially by a lot of municipalities and cities on the West Coast, like San Francisco and Los Angeles and Seattle, it's this idea that if you give away free housing and stabilize people, and just to be clear, not congregate shelters or shared shelters, but housing like studios or apartments, and you get the homeless into these places, that all of their problems will be solved. No strings attached. But while housing is definitely part of the solution to fixing the nation's homeless crisis, the study shows that it's primarily being fueled by mental illness and drug addiction. As we all have heard in the past few years, multiple cities now suing big pharmaceutical companies, consulting companies for pushing and fueling the opioid epidemic. And that is now ravaging America's streets. And until the politicians, the leaders, the elected officials wake up in these communities being hammered by the homeless crisis, especially in our respective cities, San Francisco and Seattle, this crisis is going to continue. So I went to DC. We highlighted this report, but my job as a reporter is not to write these white papers. I'm not a senior fellow in the classic sense where I do all this data research and present a 40-page study and bring it in front of the politicians and go all over the place to present it and do road shows. I don't do that. I tell the stories through video. And Ravi, I wanted to thank you as well. You've also shot some video for me while you were in Washington, D.C., but you've seen with your own eyes. I wanted to ask you, could you believe what you were seeing in the nation's capital?
Well, I mean, let's face it. I can't say I'm surprised. I mean, I live in the Bay Area. I've seen what's happened in San Francisco. Again, it's not the same city that I grew up in. And it's no surprise when I talk to folks that I know in Philadelphia and Washington. You go around this country, you see encampments set up. And a lot of it happened because of COVID. You have a lot of folks that are, have been hit hard. But, let's face it, mental illness is spreading because, folks who were shut in for a couple of years. It has not been a normal social situation. So when that gets exacerbated to the point where, okay, you're in financial hardship and you're in dire straits and you end up on the street, I mean, this whole thing just snowballs. And then before you know it, I mean, we're seeing, young, healthy people on the street taking all kinds of drugs. And it's heartbreaking. And yet, let's face it, some of the politicians who are trying to be compassionate ultimately have not addressed the root cause. And so it just piles on. And I know you've been covering this thing extensively. Basically it's your day job at this point. And, are there solutions? I know this was the homeless czar, I believe, that you were walking around with under President Trump.
Yeah.
What are the concrete solutions that the Democrats and the Republicans have? Because let's face it, this has exacerbated over multiple administrations.
Yeah, first of all, you hit on so many key points. Let's just start with the solutions. Yes, there are solutions. And what this report is suggesting is that on top of finding affordable housing and doing something about the, housing crunch that so many big cities are facing right now, you have to require addiction treatment. You have to require treatment for mental illness. If that means institutionalization, so be it. But right now, unfortunately, what a lot of these policies, these lax democratic policies in many cases, is allowing is this housing first model, which is no strings attached. They want to go and they've believed, again, in this business, we know that if we want to, frame our argument a certain way or back up our argument, we can commission a study. So there are dozens of studies out there. But in terms of measurables, is housing first really working? Think about that premise. You give somebody housing who's addicted to drugs, who has mental illness, and you somehow expect them to, just because they're in a new place, an apartment, all their problems go away? Absolutely not. There has to be strings attached. There has to be social workers involved. There has to be people walking with the men and women who are addicted to drugs. In virtually 90+% of the cases, I am telling you what I see every single day on the streets of Seattle, here in Washington State, somebody is using some form of illegal drug. And I get it. They're there for various reasons. And I want to be very clear. I'm not saying all the homeless are criminals or they're all addicts. You have drug dealers now preying on these lost souls. You have sex trafficking going on. You cannot allow these encampments to continue as is. So what I'm saying, again, what this Discovery Institute study is talking about is you've got to now start putting in requirements. You've got to show tough love. Is this really compassion? Allowing people to overdose in 2021, more than 80,000 Americans died of an opioid overdose. Not just on the streets, but, the average working Joe or Jane as well. But this is crazy. It's flooding the streets, and I'm going to argue it's hammering the homeless community more than any other.
Well, I mean, we've seen the footage. It's graphic, and yet I know you take a lot of grief for covering this thing. And what do you make of this stuff when you get criticized for showcasing what is unfortunate reality?
Well, I'm doing it because the mainstream media is failing to do it, or just not doing it at the scale that I believe needs to happen. Look, I'm showing just the raw realities. If somebody in the Chinatown International District here in Seattle has to live next to this, walk next to this, raise their families next to this, right? But nobody's covering this in the mainstream media, it's almost like it's not even happening. That's why you and I are in this business, to show what's happening. But what's really important is not just to point a camera and say, look at the problem. It's to provide context. Then also the solutions, the people talking about solutions. And it's also about holding our public officials accountable. That's what this show is about too, right? It's about highlighting the problems, but also showing where public policy could be failing. And again, Housing First is failing. It's been tried for the past decade. Promises were made by homeless advocates a decade ago. By 2023, that's just in 2 months, that America's homeless crisis would end if they followed this Housing First strategy. And I get it. Life has happened. I get it. COVID, pandemic totally, delayed even Dr. Robert Marbert Jr.'s implementation of his policies against, fighting this homeless crisis in the Trump administration, because it was all hands on deck for COVID. But now that we're finally emerging out of COVID, this country really needs to reassess and take stock of what's working and what's not, and be willing, in my opinion, to say this is not working, so we need to scrap it and we've got to correct course. Otherwise, we're heading down this road. We're losing now an entire generation of Americans, not just to the homeless crisis, but to the addiction crisis, mental illness, which at the root of it, I believe, and based on the studies at the Discovery Institute that I'm seeing every single day because of my reporting, I believe those are the root causes: mental illness and the drug addiction crisis.
Well, believe it or not, and I never thought this was going to be the case, this has become a core issue of the midterms. And I think on November 8th, we're going to see the topic of homelessness, in addition to just the housing crunch we have in a lot of major cities. Those things are all these things, public safety, it's all intertwined. I had a chance to moderate this debate in San Jose between Matt Mahan, Cindy Chavez, the two leading candidates. And literally the first topic, and again, they were trying to target the Indian community and the Vietnamese community. The number one topic was homelessness. So if you're seeing that in a very targeted way, they're trying to reach certain communities, but that is the number one agenda item, along with public safety. It shows this thing resonates, and we're going to say on November 8th, whoever has these policy solutions, whoever can articulate their message, they're likely to get ahead this fall. Let's move on, though. I do want to get into some other topics here, Jonathan, because I know we can talk about homelessness all day long. You've been
all day, man. That's my beat.
Yeah, it is your beat. Let's get into this Joe Tsai situation now. The Brooklyn Nets. We do cover the NBA. Have been covering the NBA Finals for years. But Joe Tsai,
we're huge sports fans.
Yeah, I mean, his franchise a bit of turmoil as we are filming this. They just announced that Steve Nash and the Nets have parted ways. That was kind of a long time coming. That it just didn't work out the last couple of years, even though they were on the precipice of maybe winning a championship. But this summer, everything imploded, and Tsai and Kyrie Irving certainly at odds right now.
Yeah, so I'm literally looking at the tweet right now. This was first reported by Outkick. It's an online outfit here. The headline: Nets owner Joe Tsai blocks Florida Republican Representative Matt Gaetz on Twitter for pointing out the China Kyrie hypocrisy. That's sort of the headline here. But the backstory and why this is so significant is, once again, there's going to be a theme that comes up on our show here, protected speech. The mainstream media, Ravi, is just not covering these stories in the way it deserves, with just the ferocious coverage. And Outkick here with a great piece calling out this double standard and hypocrisy. Joe Tsai, the Taiwanese Canadian-born owner of the Brooklyn Nets of the NBA, with some high-profile players like Kyrie Irving. Recently, just in light of this, unrelated but just a coincidence, music superstar Kanye West, now who goes by Ye, essentially lost his business empire for saying anti-Semitic or making anti-Semitic remarks on social media. Kyrie, along those same lines, recently posted, and I'm reading this right now, a link to his followers on social media last week, encouraging them to buy the film Hebrews to Negroes, Wake Up Black America. The film's based on the 2015 book of the same name, which preaches ideas closely aligned with the Black Hebrew Israelite extremists. Anyway, regardless, Joe Tsai puts Kyrie Irving, on blast in some ways because he did it publicly and said, I need to sit down with you, Kyrie. We shouldn't be, putting things out like that publicly, especially as a representative of the NBA's Brooklyn Nets. And, some may find that offensive and anti-Semitic. Well, guess what? Joe Tsai, apparently, in this great column in Outkick, is essentially silent when it comes to all the atrocities happening right now in China, especially with the Uyghur Muslims who are now in camps, being retrained, and essentially not being allowed to practice their faith. So the hypocrisy, the call out really was, hey, Joe, why aren't you talking about any of the human rights violations that are happening in China? And Kapur, I'll let you take this one, but we all know what the reason is. The NBA and so many companies now in America are in bed and have financial interests with China, right?
I mean, that's the reality. I mean, look, I've seen in recent years, the Warriors, Steph Curry would go almost annually to China. Klay Thompson has a deal with Anta, a Chinese shoe company, and so did some of his teammates. LeBron James, huge influence in China. So you can't eliminate a billion-plus person market that is that loves the NBA. And we saw, remember the Houston Rockets controversy with their former general manager Daryl Morey made some comments about Hong Kong. Remember, free Hong Kong, and that was the end of the Houston Rockets being shown in China. That was the end of Morey's basically tenure with the Rockets. After that, it was just downhill. Now he's in Philadelphia. The 76ers are not allowed in China. So if you go up against the Chinese government in any capacity, you're going to lose that opportunity, that economic opportunity, and that all the players
because they'll literally cancel you. You'll be ostracized, and if you're a Chinese national and you speak up or criticize the CCP, you're going to go missing.
Well,
a recent female tennis star, the CEO of Alibaba, Jack Ma, who had to go into hiding but has now recently come back out. I mean, this is scary stuff.
This is the reality, though. I mean, let's face it. You see what's going on in all of these countries. There is censorship. I mean, heck, even in this country, in the United States, we have a conflict going on in between Russia and Ukraine, and there is no Russian media allowed, basically, in the United States. Remember, I don't know if you recall, but
they're accused of being propaganda. Then, right? Anything that sides with the Russian narrative is considered propaganda.
Correct. Let's face it. What a lot of people don't know is that in the United States, we have a channel called CGTN, which is it's China Global Television. That's funded by the CCP. You have Deutsche Welle, which is funded by the German government. You have France 24, funded by the French government. You go up and down the line, Al Jazeera by the Qataris, BBC, funded by the Brits. So all these different channels come into the United States, no problem. But of course, the U.S. is helping Ukraine. So all of the Russian information is blocked. I mean, I've had all kinds of conversations with folks in media who are like, hey, this is way too hot for us to deal with. It's been pulled from the cable systems, pulled by radio stations. I'm telling you, there are people who've had their licenses challenged. I know one guy who happens to be a Chinese American. He was running Sputnik radio on a small station outside of Washington, D.C. with Russian programming. They were suing him over his licenses because he was running Russian content. So this is how serious it can get. And we're seeing this across the board. And
the average American has no clue this is going on behind the scenes. Ravi, I'm listening to you right now. It sounds like you're spewing a conspiracy theory, but this is really happening at the high level, especially in the media game, because you're an executive and you're seeing all this wheeling and dealing and essentially people, trying to navigate these treacherous waters, because at the end of the day, almost everything runs through China now when it comes to business, right? That's the next emerging market.
Well, keep in mind now, they've even changed the rules of the FCC. So if you are getting programming that's funded by a foreign government, which there has been historically a lot of foreign programming funded from overseas, you have to disclose that. And so that's actually pulled a lot of the carriage. So CGTN, financed by the Chinese government, that's been a lot of stations have pulled it off the air. In fact, even Fox in the San Francisco area.
Why don't you think the mainstream media is covering this, huh? Why don't you think this is being discussed further?
I mean, the media,
a double standard that you're laying out everywhere.
Jonathan, the media does not cover the media. You know that. I know that. We both know that. The media does not cover the media. They only cover the scandal. They cover the talents, right? If Bill O'Reilly or Chris Cuomo or someone goes off the rails, or Kanye West is the fodder today, they'll go after personalities, but brands that's a whole other thing, right? We have an entrenched system here. All this revenue goes to the established players. And keep in mind, media's changed, right? We have a show here that's getting distributed in 20 different ways that didn't exist a decade ago. And so the established players don't necessarily want to lose. They don't want to lose their monopolies. They're holding on to the revenue, but their influence is waning. And that's why, let's face it, what you've done on Twitter, building an audience, actually matters, because you're showcasing content that other people can't find, and hopefully folks can find this show and get viewpoints that they're not going to find anywhere else. So let's get into another topic here quickly, because we want to talk about this week in. Unfortunately, we're kind of dubbing it This Week in AAPI Hate, because it's a segment. It's also sponsored
it's
by.
Sad that it's come down to that we have to put a segment like this on.
It is, and this is sponsored by the California Public Library. We appreciate them supporting us putting this particular segment together, because unfortunately we have another incident of a hate crime, and this one I just got wind of, but it happened in Albany, New York. Again, a little bit off the radar. We've seen stuff in San Francisco, we've seen stuff in New York City, but Albany, New York, I mean, this was an unbelievable video where this young man here comes from behind and he stabs this Asian American kid. These are both high school kids, I think 18 and 17 respectively. And he stabs this kid in the back. I don't care what the issue is, but that's unbelievable. And of course, this kid holds on for dear life. And he's actually, if you see the Asian student there, he's holding the young man. He's holding the knife, which give him credit for being able to hold this guy off. And then you'll see, in this video, there's obviously screaming and yelling, but people are just documenting it through cell phones. And eventually, you have an elder here that's about to intervene and get the knife away. But this stuff is happening so often, Jonathan. It's really hard to even conceive. I know we've all dealt with bullying. I know you and I both dealt with it as kids. But I mean, with a knife in school, I'm beside myself. I don't
look. I'm watching the video right now. It is just heartbreaking for both kids that it's even gotten to this point. But man, this is attempted murder. Okay, and the teen, I don't know how old this kid is, and I don't know what exacerbated this, what led up to this. But man, this is just heartbreaking when you're seeing these two kids go at it. I want to be very careful here and qualify everything that I'm about to say. We don't know the motive. We don't know if this was fueled by quote unquote Asian hate, but this is an example of hate against the Asian American community. And unfortunately, once again, we're seeing these video images, and that's why I think context matters. And I want to be very careful as we talk about what we're seeing. We're only seeing a snippet. We don't see the before or really the after, and again, what led up to this and what happened after the fact. But we're just seeing in the moment. But man, these are the optics. We're in the optics game. This video is going viral right now, and once again, all we see is a black kid railing, literally trying to potentially kill an Asian American kid. The Asian American kid, he's not the perpetrator. It's clear. It looks like he's just trying to defend himself, because the Asian kid we see initially is apparently running away from the kid in the red shirt with this knife. And all we see, and give credit to this Asian kid in probably heat of the moment, it appears he's been stabbed multiple times, yet he's still standing and he's now holding the knife.
Yeah, he did get stabbed. He got stabbed a couple times in the neck area. And apparently he survived. I mean, it does seem like
thank God that nobody died.
Yeah,
because if this kid died, that's the tragedy. But then this other young man who was allegedly stabbing this kid could be going away for a long time, and his life would be over.
Here's what's wild. If you see now, as the adults step into the area here, this kid's getting beaten on. This adult steps in, and he actually throws the Asian kid away, because it looked as if they thought the Asian kid was the guy provoking the situation. See, now this guy gets in there, gets the knife away, calls for other assistance, gets other elders, and then they break these kids apart. And it's the Asian kid that gets thrown to the ground here.
In fairness, I think if you're an adult in the heat of the moment, you're just trying to separate them. So I don't think the Asian kid was being targeted.
But, I mean,
the Asian kid was obviously furious and probably wanted to, retaliate. And I don't blame him. But man, I mean, this is ridiculous. This is the problem I have. You see videos like this, they keep on going viral. Okay, what this does is it further divides the community, Because I'm watching this as a journalist. My job is now to assess, report, see what's going on, get multiple sides, talk to ideally the kids. This is how I would stack a story if I was personally covering this, right? This video is going viral. Somebody says, you got to go cover this. I go out to that school, try to get a statement from the school, try to get both kids on camera. That would likely not happen. At the very least, talk to both parents if both parents are involved, and just talk about what happens next and how did we get to this point. But then I would also, and this is the key, I think, and this is where you and I, as Asian American reporters, I think what we would try to do is get reaction from the community, both sides, right? And I'm not saying just because you get a leader from the Asian community or a leader from the Black community that's a representative of everyone in those communities, because we both know we're not a monolith either way, right? But at the very least, I would want to get reaction, because after incidents like this, it's so easy now to say, okay, there you go. Once again, here's the proof. Black people hate Asians, right? Or Asians are just victims of Asian hate, and so on and so forth. Again, we don't know the motive. We don't know if anything racist was said, but I want to be very clear, not to dismiss the gravity and magnitude of how this video hits now. It continues to fuel this narrative that Black people are targeting Asians, which furthers the divide. Because, look, there's racism on both sides. We know that. But we've got to flesh this out. And the mainstream media likely will not even cover this in many cases, outside of some of the local, channels or papers. But nationally, this discussion needs to continue and be fleshed out.
Well, it's part of the reason we're going to cover it each and every week on this program, because I've just seen so much of this over the last couple of years, and we've seen it in all the major cities. But, Albany is it's the capital of New York, but it's
this stuff you don't hear coming out of Albany, New York. I mean, it's not a major city like New York City, like a Manhattan, where you're hearing all this stuff, or even a Seattle or San Francisco or other areas of the country where this continues to happen. And by the way, I want to be very clear. The Asian American community is still dealing with Asian hate incidents, crimes, not just, assaults, but, name calling, spitting, which is assault, but also the intimidation, the taunting. And historically, Asian Americans, in many ways, have not reported these for various reasons. Shame, unsure how to, language barrier. And again, Asian Americans in, the Chinatown International District alone in Seattle, you have already 5 different languages: Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese. You have Filipinos speaking a different language, Tagalog, right? And even Korean in many cases. So think about that. You have people speaking all these different languages, getting attacked various ways. Who's ultimately the elder or the leader who's going to help that victim take it to the next level, file a report, go through the process? Many people don't even want to deal with this. That's why it's not getting reported. It's underreported in the Asian American community, right? And I'm just talking about East Asians. What about the Sikhs? What about the Indians who have been targeted? We can go on and on.
There are stories. Ravi. I mean, you and I have been covering these stories, not just this year, but for the last few years. And we could go in many different directions, frankly. There's other folks that are provocateurs that are targeting Asian American communities, and we will continue to highlight. So this is the latest one, unfortunately, that we had to bring up, and we're going to continue to
we have many more
program. Jonathan, any final words here as we wrap up this program? We always appreciate your time. I know it's been a busy week. The midterms are finally here, and we're going to see, I think, an impact from all this coverage that we've both been doing. Especially when it comes to these topics, homelessness and public safety. I think it's going to be on the docket here on November 8th.
Yeah, you pretty much finished my sentence. That's what I'm going to be working on here in Seattle, in this region as well: public safety and the homeless crisis, and kind of the response, what's being done, what's working, what's not, and kind of as we go into the new year. I mean, we cannot continue business as usual in this country.
Well, for Jonathan Choe, I'm Ravi Kapur. Thanks for joining us for this edition of Protected Speech. By the way, we're having an election night special on Dia TV, 3 hours live starting at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. Jonathan, feel free to make an appearance from wherever you're going to be. It should be fun. We're going to bring in all the political leaders from around the country as the election results roll in on Tuesday, November 8th. For our entire team, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next week here on Protected Speech.
Peace.